my name is Panetta, and today my group is going to go over the chemistry of hair dye.
And I'm Caroline Morgan.
I'm Stella Fleming.
And I'm Ariana Scott. So before we talk about the actual chemistry of hair dye, we're going to go into a little bit of depth of how hair dye came to be. So hair dye originated in ancient Egypt, but ancient Romans and ancient Greeks also used forms of natural hair dye. Berries, nutshells, vinegar, and lead were all ways to naturally dye people's hair. And in ancient Greece, prostitutes were actually required to have blonde hair, so they would use mixtures of plant-based materials to lighten their hair. And then hair color also showed rank and kind of frightened the other side during battles. Eugene Schuler, in 1907, he marketed the first hair color formula, and this was using PPD, which we'll talk about a little later in our presentation. His company today is L'Oreal, and he was actually a French pharmacist.
Okay, so why does hair dye even work? First, to discuss this, we need to start with the hair anatomy. The shaft of the hair strand is the part that is outside of your scalp, and it contains keratin and melanin. Looking at the cross-section here, the outermost layer is called the cuticle, and that is what contains all the keratin. That is the protective layer around the hair strand. The next layer is called the cortex. This contains all of the natural pigment in your hair, which is called melanin. It's the same compound that gives skin different tones. The more melanin you have, the darker your hair is. The innermost layer is called the medulla. However, it's not common in all types of hair, and it's not very important for our discussion. So how does the hair dye even break in? Permanent hair dyes contain an alkaline element, usually ammonia, and it has a pH of 11.6. However, your hair is acidic with a pH of 4.5 to 5.5. So when that ammonia comes in contact with your hair, it causes the hair to open by swelling and condensing over and over again. As you can see here, originally the cuticle is completely shut, but once it gets in contact with the ammonia in this step, it opens up the cuticle. This causes the damage that people worry about with constantly dyeing hair, and it is something to consider if you're thinking about using permanent dye. Once the shaft is open, the coloring molecules are able to go into the cortex and begin the actual coloring process. Step 1 is oxidation. The oxidizing agent, usually in permanent dyes, is hydrogen peroxide. Once it enters the shaft and goes into the cortex, it oxidizes melanin in the hair, making it colorless. This is the bleaching step, and Caroline will go more in depth about this later. The hydrogen peroxide also oxidizes precursors, making them reactive. As you can see here, the shaft is filled with dye precursors. Once it is hit with the hydrogen peroxide, it then becomes more permanent and is able to dye the cortex fully. So as you look here, this is the actual reaction mechanism of oxidation. Over on the left is the precursor PPD, which we will also talk about later in Ari's section. It is a diamine aromatic molecule. Once it is hit with the hydrogen peroxide, it becomes this semiquinone diamine radical intermediate. It then immediately reacts with another dose of hydrogen peroxide to become paraquinone diamine, QDI, which is the reactive intermediate. Starting over here, PPD is completely colorless, but throughout the oxidation process, it then becomes this molecule, which is colorful. It is usually just a darker brown, and then once it reacts with couplers that we talk about later, it then becomes the final permanent dye that can be any range of colors that you desire.
So as Mary mentioned earlier, after an oxidation, you're going to have your primary intermediate go to reactive intermediate. And when this reacts with a coupler, it creates an endo dye, which is the final dye that actually dyes hair. So the two components of color precursors, which I mentioned before, were the primary intermediates and the couplers, and these are what create a final dye. So both of these are aromatic compounds derived from benzene, and they have electron donor groups. These are usually NH2 or OH. In the primary intermediate, they're in the para or ortho positions, and in the coupler, they are in the meta position. The para/ortho positions allow for easy oxidation, which is what we want for them to react with the coupler, and the coupler's meta position prevents them from easy oxidation. So here are a couple common primary intermediates, as we mentioned before, PPD, which is p-phenylenediamine, and then also p-aminophenol. As you can see, these are in para positions. We have two NH2 groups and then an NH2 and an OH group. PPD actually darkens when oxidized, as Mary mentioned before, and it's sometimes even used as a substitute for henna. In recent years, it's been found that severe allergic reactions can come from using PPD in hair dye, so a lot of companies have kind of strayed away from using it. So as I mentioned before, this is the second coupling step. This is where these two compounds derived from benzene come together in a coupling reaction, and it will create the wanted color when reacting with said intermediate, and we will see that in the next slide. So here we have a reactive intermediate in our coupler. Our coupler here is 2-methyl-5-amino benzene, and these react in a coupling reaction to give a leuco intermediate, which this is actually colorless. And then in the next slide, we see that this is finally oxidized and it gives our final dye color, which is actually a magenta indo dye. So a lot of you may have wondered what exactly is in your hair dye, and we're going to go a little bit into depth on that. So there are actually 7 main components of a hair dye. First of all, you have your base cream. This is an emulsion of an oil component and a water component, and this is what actually transports the dye to your hair. And then, as we talked about before, you have your color precursors, which include your couplers and your primary intermediates, which actually give the color to the dye. And then our alkalizing agents, as Mary talked about before, this is usually ammonia. This is what opens up the hair shaft and allows the color to go inside. Your curing agents, those are the fancy things that companies put in your hair dye to kind of care for your hair. As we talked about earlier, this often leads to breakage and drying out hair. So this kind of keeps the hair moisturized as best as it can. Antioxidants, they do exactly as it sounds. They prevent the oxidation of hair. This is usually the primary intermediates as they're in the tube, because we don't want them to be prematurely oxidized and start those reactions before we're actually applying it to the hair. Complexing agents, these prevent unwanted reactions with hydrogen peroxide. By doing so, they envelop potential metal impurities within the coloring cream. And then finally, perfumes are used mainly to just mask the smell of ammonia, as this can be really harsh. So here we have an Ion Permanent Brights hair color in an emerald. As you can see, there are lots of things that go into a hair dye. All of these seem very complicated. There's lots of chemicals that do go into hair dye. Most notably, we have our color precursors. We have 1 coupler and 2 intermediates, and when they come together in the steps that we talked about before, they actually do form an emerald color.
So why does lighter hair pick up color better than darker hair? The answer has to do with the type of melanin in the hair, so let's talk about the 2 different types of melanin. So there's eumelanin, and that causes hair to appear darker, so it's in shades brown to black, and there's also pheomelanin, and that's in lighter hair, so shades red to blonde. So let's look at the different structures. So as we can see, this is eumelanin, and it has a lot of conjugated double bonds, and this is important because the amount of conjugated double bonds has to do with the hair color, so since there are more, the hair color appears darker. And tying this back to the question, why does lighter hair hold color better than darker hair? It's because people with lighter hair have more pheomelanin than eumelanin, so the dye will be much easier to see. However, if dark hair is not bleached prior to adding dye, the dye will be difficult to see due to the high concentration of eumelanin that was already present in the hair. So I just mentioned hair bleaching. So in order for people with dark hair to get dye to show up, they usually bleach, and how this works is that we have eumelanin, and it's oxidized, so it's initially like this orthohydroquinone. So we have 2 OH groups that are on this ring, and they're ortho to each other, and that gets oxidized to form this semipermanent radical. So there's an OH group, and ortho to it there's an oxygen radical. That gets further oxidized to form this orthoquinone, so there's a ring, and 2 oxygens that are double bonded. And then that gets oxidized in an irreversible reaction to form this final structure, and it's known as a ferulic acid. And then as you can see, this structure has a lot less conjugated double bonds, which means it's pretty colorless. In this reaction, it's important to understand that it's very complicated, so this is very generalized. And in the world of chemistry, it's actually not totally understood yet.
So how are permanent and semi-permanent dyes different? Let's discuss the different kinds of dyes. So in the world of hair care, there are thousands of different kinds of hair dyes, but they all fall into 4 different categories. The first category is permanent, which completely changes the color of your hair. I will go further into depth with how this happens in the next slide. Next we have semi-permanent, which lasts only several washes and does not change the original color of the hair. It also contains more shine than other dyes like demi-permanent and temporary. Demi-permanent mainly is just pigment and has no gloss or shine to it, and it washes out quicker than semi-permanent. And lastly, there's temporary, which only lasts about 1 to 2 washes, and it's just pigment. It typically comes in forms of chalk, liquid, mascara wand, something like that. Now I will go more into depth with permanent versus semi-permanent dyes. The biggest difference between the 2 kinds of dyes is that permanent dye contains ammonia and hydrogen peroxide. As Mary mentioned before, the ammonia helps to open up the hair shaft and help the color become deposited in the shaft. The hydrogen peroxide simultaneously will remove the color and help to deposit the new color in the dye. Since the hair shaft is open, the color stays permanently and cannot be removed, but it can be changed by more dye. The semi-permanent dye does not contain ammonia, so it just sits more on the surface of your hair and it washes out quicker. Natural hair color will remain intact because of this, and once the rest of the semi-permanent dye washes out, your original color will remain.
Thank you for watching our video. Here are our sources.